When I was 13 months old, I lost my father to some suspicious circumstances, possible murder. So I unfortunately never got the luxury to have a strong relationship with him. However, I vividly remember his face, his laugh, and many memories of us playing together. Even stranger was that my memories from the house my mother and I moved into after he passed in our old home. I remember playing games, tea party, and even dressing up with him. But the oddest part was that the photos my mom took of me when I was playing with him, there would always be an orb next to me, same colour, shape, and size. My mom always thought it was the camera, but it was never in the same spot. Fast forward to when I was about 6 years old. I remember it was Christmas Eve, so I was excitedly waiting for Santa Claus to come. I just remember what felt like someone kissing me goodnight. And when I sat up excitedly to see, whom I hoped was Santa, lol, instead I saw this extremely bright light coming from the hall. Now my mother was laying in bed next to me, fast asleep, and we had nobody else in the house. But I just remember watching it in awe, as it was a beautiful blue flash of light that seemed to open and then close. I remember writing it off as Santa leaving, so I excitedly woke my mother up to go open my presents. It was about 3 a.m. Now, obviously, as I got older and learned that Santa wasn't real, I questioned what I saw that night. It wasn't a car light, an electrical malfunction, or a TV that was accidentally turned on, and after mentioning it to my mother as an adult, I truly believe I watched him cross over. My reasoning? My mother told me in high school that she believed my dad's spirit was with me in the house. She said it was okay at first, but that she thinks he was playing tricks on her, like he did when he was alive. And hearing me talk to him all the time and seeing the orbs in all my photos began to freak her out. Well, it turned out that night, Christmas Eve, her best friend who had come for dinner had helped her cleanse the spirit away, and that after she did, I never mentioned my father or played with him again. My mother wrote off my seeing the bright light as my crazy childhood imagination. But as horrible as my memory is from my childhood, the feeling and image I got from that light that night has always felt so real and raw to me. I still remember the feeling of peace and happiness that washed over me when I saw it. And now, 17 years later, I believe wholeheartedly I watched my dad cross over. So, I'm pretty sure I watched my dad cross over. So, all this strangeness started about 3 months ago. My wife and I started seeing and hearing strange things around the house. Footsteps, muted voices in the walls, etc. For a while, we were convinced that someone was living in our attic, but after having some fellow church members go up there for repairs, we know that's not the case. At one point, our walls were vibrating rhythmically, almost like a phone, but we had both of our phones and knew it wasn't any of our devices. These are things that I experienced as well, not just my wife. We also had another shared experience involving a video baby monitor, through which we could see floating orbs that would dance together in an intelligent way, always over the baby's crib. I know about cameras, and it wasn't due to reflections or dust. We could see the orbs with our eyes, but they would appear through the monitor. So I went to where they were showing on the screen and put my hand out, and as we watched on the screen, they would converge on my hand and dance around my hand. It was the most bizarre thing. My wife has suffered from sleep paralysis and seen a lot of strange things, including about 3 or 4 unique demons or shadow people that would visit from time to time. They all looked different and had different feelings to them. The next morning, my wife would always tell me which ones had been present the night before. Sometimes they just stood and watched. Other times, they tried to get my wife to react to them in some way. There There was even a time when a light/good one came and talked with one of the dark ones. She says that one in particular that comes that just stands for a very long time, and the only word she has for it is that it's curious and trying to learn about us. She says that one has been coming more regularly, and it just gives off this intense vibe of trying to learn about us for some nefarious purpose. She says if she ignores them, they go away much faster, so she's gotten really good at pretending like they're not there. About a month or so ago, my wife was going to the bathroom in the night and saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs at the end of the hall. She described it as being totally solid looking, around 5'6", with arms and legs that ended in points, not hands and feet. The head was almost totally spherical and was a lot larger than a normal human's head. It was standing on the floor, not floating above it. It wasn't blurry around the edges, but totally solid and crisp looking. She knew this was the same entity which had visited a number of times already, the curious one that was a scout of some kind. It was trying to learn about us. She said it turned and saw her looking, and as soon as it saw her, it turned and walked through a closed door that leads to my office. She said it just phased through it like Harry and Ron going through the big barrier leading to the Hogwarts Express. She continued to the bathroom, which butts up against the office, which is the next room over. The toilet is on the wall that is shared by both the bathroom and the office. She said the whole time she was on the toilet, she felt the entity in my office moving around and putting off a strange, darkly curious vibe. She said she almost got the courage to go barge into my office and confront it, but she decided she didn't want to agitate whatever it was, because she says they want her to react in some way. So she finished in the bathroom and came to bed, and didn't sleep the rest of the night, listening for anything. She said soon after returning to bed, the feeling dissipated, and it was gone. A few days later, my wife started hearing a specific low growling voice that told her to physically harm herself, and that no one loved or cared about her. The voice wasn't in her head, but out in the open room somewhere. She said it was from one of the same beings she would see in her sleep paralysis episodes. I didn't experience anything like this during this time, however, but I am not at all sensitive to anything paranormal, so I wouldn't expect to be able to see or hear anything anyway. Okay, now this is where things start to get really interesting. And this is where I started to witness some of the strangeness firsthand, in addition to the initial strange things my wife and I both experienced near the beginning. So a week later, during her morning shower, my wife said an entity came into the bathroom and started trying to engage her in conversation. It was taunting her. It wasn't visible, but she could feel it. It was again one of the beings she would feel or see during her sleep paralysis. She said it wasn't speaking verbally, but in thoughts. It wanted to get a response from her, but she ignored it and said it stayed in the room until she was done, getting angry at her and coming up directly behind her. Then it followed her out of the room when she was done, but then disappeared off into the house somewhere, and she came downstairs. I had been watching our two sons while she was in the shower. She came down, and I could tell there was something wrong. But all she said was, "I want to tell you something later." At the time, I didn't know anything about what she had experienced, which makes what happened next even stranger. A moment later, my younger son, who's 1.5, reaches up toward the stairs and starts pointing frantically. His finger is following something invisible as it moves across the room. His eyes are wide and he's trying to get down from my wife's lap. Right then, my older son, who's 3, reaches up and begins to point also. And I notice they are both pointing in the same direction and following it with their eyes, as if they're watching someone walking across the room. My younger son finally wiggles free and starts running across the room toward whatever they've been pointing at. Then my older son, who speaks very clearly, says, "Look, Gabriel is following that man into the dining room." My older son then follows, and they both walk into the dining room. I follow them and see my younger son pulling frantically at a bookshelf we use for our Bibles and Bible study groups, like dictionaries and concordances and things like that. I pick up my older son and ask him what they are looking at. He said, "That man, sitting on the Bible shelf." Both the boys were acting so strangely and started acting really wild for a few minutes until they calmed down. And after that, it was as if they had both forgotten about the entire thing. Fast forward 3 more days until last night, when something happened that was so strange and shook me up so much that I just had to get some advice on it. So my wife went up to put our younger son to bed, and I stayed down with our older son to read him from his little kid's Bible, like I always do before bed. We read the story of Jesus healing the 10 lepers, and my son made a connection he never had before. He said, "Jesus can heal people. Jesus loves me." I was proud of my son because of his insights for someone so young, and I told him I was proud of him. He just so happened to be holding a little wooden palm cross that he had been carrying around all day as a toy. I used this as a teaching moment and told him that the cross he was holding was a reminder that Jesus loves him. He held the cross tightly and said, "Jesus loves me." It was all very touching as a parent, and so I hugged him and we headed up to brush his teeth. Well, after brushing his teeth and putting on a nighttime diaper and putting on his pajamas, we settled down into the rocking chair next to his crib for a bedtime story before I tucked him in. He kept interrupting the story I was telling him by tightly holding the cross, which I decided to let him take to bed, and telling me it meant Jesus loves him. I acknowledged what he was saying each time and patiently continued the story. Then something happened that stopped me in my tracks. My son started looking up at the ceiling and holding his cross closer to his chest. His eyes were moving around like he was watching something, but I didn't see anything. He kept this up until he said, "No, you can't have my cross." I said, "Who are you talking to?" And he said, "That man up there. He says I can't have my cross." At this point, I'm a little shaken, but decide we're going to talk about the cross again. I tell him what it means, and I suggest we sing "Jesus Loves Me." As we're singing, my son starts to whimper and looking up. I asked him what he was looking at, and he said, "That man. He says my cross is bad." At this point, I picked my son up and held him as we walked over to where he was pointing. He was pointing at something around 6'6" high. I walk right over to where he's pointing, and as I do, my son writhes back in horror. I said, "Is he right there?" And I reached out my hand to where the head would have been according to where my son was looking and pointing. He says, "Yes, Dada, don't, he's getting mad." Then my son looks all around, like the thing I had just touched was now whirling around us until it appeared to a stop right in front of us. I looked right where it should have been according to where my son was looking, and I said in a firm, confident voice, "Get out of here, now." I didn't yell, I just said it. Then I took my son and we sat back down on the rocking chair. I continued the story, and my son appeared fine for a little while, until he started looking towards a specific spot and making whimpering sounds again. He said, "That man is very mad. He wants my cross." Right after that, my son starts screaming at the top of his lungs, and then, all of a sudden, the cross he's been holding this whole time flies out of his hands with intense force and goes flying across the room, like it had been thrown hard. My son is crying and screaming at this point, and so I did the only thing I could think of. I told whatever was in the room to leave by the authority of Jesus Christ. I said it firmly. My son stopped screaming almost right away and cuddles into me. "That man went away," he said. I calm my son and tell him another story until he's sleepy, and then I lay him on his bed and leave the room. But just hold on a second, because this story is about to get weirder. Now, this was more than I had ever had happen to me before. I mean, that cross flew across the room like it had been ripped from my son's hand with strong force. I didn't know what to make of it, but it had got a lot stranger when I went into our bedroom to talk to my wife. As soon as I walked into the room, my wife, with fear in her eyes, said, "You'll never guess what happened to me and Gabe when I was putting him to bed." At that point, my heart sank because I knew what I had just experienced. I didn't say anything, but just let her talk. She said she was just getting our younger son sleepy in his room, and she heard Gideon start screaming. She said right after he stopped screaming, she felt a palpable wave of total evil sweep through the room. She described it like a shockwave of evil energy that came blasting from our older son's room. She said it passed through her and our younger son, and at that very moment, he started writhing. My wife was thrown back by the force of it, and she said it was the worst, most evil, horrible thing she'd ever experienced, and she could feel it in her bones as she described it. She said she will never forget that feeling of total evil and pure hatred sweeping across the room. She said she felt it right after my older son stopped screaming. I just stood and listened to what she was saying. Before I told her anything about what I had experienced, it didn't take me long to realize that our timelines matched up exactly. The moment she felt the wave of pure evil blast from out of our room, of our older son's room, was the exact moment I had commanded it to leave by the authority of Jesus. I stood there, shocked for a while, before I said, "I have something to tell you also. We better go downstairs and talk." As we walked down the stairs, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. On the floor were some shapes made of black masking tape that my wife made for the boys to jump on yesterday. They had been jumping from shape to shape to learn about the shapes. Well, the two most prominent, which were in the middle of the room and the largest of all, were a cross and what was supposed to be a star, but was actually a pentagram. I had noticed the shapes earlier in the day, but I hadn't noticed that one was a pentagram. I'm not saying this had anything to do with it, but it's so strange we had an apparently demonic experience involving a cross the exact same day those symbols were on the floor of the living room. Needless to say, I ripped them up off the floor after that. Soon after, we heard our older boy screaming again from upstairs, and we ran up there. He said that another man was trying to take his cross. It was then that I remembered hearing someone say that sage is supposed to help with stuff like this. My wife has a few essential oils and a diffuser laying around for stress relief, but we hadn't used them in a long time. So I had her to go get it and put some sage and frankincense in it, and put the diffuser in my older son's room. It calmed him down immediately, and he went soundly to sleep and slept the entire night after that. So in 2016, I bought a car. I hadn't owned one in 3 years because my other one was stolen and I couldn't afford to replace it. I woke up that day just knowing my car was out there. I'd been looking very lightly for a couple of months, but I knew I just would know when the time was right. Sure enough, that day I saw my car on Craigslist. One owner, high mileage but well maintained, $800. I had a budget of $1,200, so it was perfect. The couple were fantastic, just really nice people who said, "We knew this car would find the right owner, and it's you. The car is going to get you in the next phase of your life." 6 years later, and I'm still driving this car. It's fantastic. It was flawlessly maintained and will serve me for years to come, I'm sure. I even wrote the owners a couple of years ago to give them an update. Great people. So 2 years ago, I was involved in a little fender bender. I had moved 100 miles away from LA, where I had bought the car, and where I live now we have rough winters, feet of snow, etc. So I'm coming around this curve and suddenly hit a patch of ice on a day that was 60 degrees, so I wasn't expecting it. And sideswipe a car parked alongside the road. Their car had more damage than mine, and it was obviously my fault as I had skiddled something like 50 feet and managed to merely sidesweep instead of T-bone them. We took photos of each other's insurance cards, I call it in, etc. My car is fine except for a cracked headlight. Well, the next day, the insurance guy calls me. The card belongs to a couple who were not in your town at the time. Me and the AAA guy were puzzled, and a few days later, he lets me know that the card belonged to a couple who had some stuff stolen from their car the week before, nowhere near the accident. This obviously implies that the people I ran into had been the thieves. I'll probably never know. I never heard anything else about it. My insurance went up about $5, and the car I had hit was a rental, so I don't hear anything else about it. Fast forward to this evening. I'm going through my email attachments trying to find a photo, and I stumble on the pics of the insurance card the couple had given me. I notice the names. The name of the man is a Spanish name, his full name. I'll say the name on the card was Eduardo, but it was the former owners of my car. I hadn't connected the two at the time because of the Spanish name, and I had only known him as Ed. So I wrote the owners and said, perhaps the card dropped on the ground from my car. I have no explanation. He writes back 10 minutes later, call me immediately. I have the explanation. Amazing. I just got off the phone with them. The insurance card didn't belong to my own car, so it didn't fall out upon impact. It was for their other car, and they had indeed had someone steal a lunchbox and wallets from their car in Pasadena a week before my accident. Of all the millions of people in SoCal, I somehow managed to sideswipe people who were somehow in possession of a stolen insurance card that belonged to the freaking former owners of my car. That's 100 miles away from Pasadena. All of our minds are blown, and this is so rare of a occurrence that I can't help but think it's mathematically on par with being bitten by the same shark on the same leg at the same time 20 years later or something. Ed kept saying, this is a good omen. This is incredible. What a good omen. I mean, I knew the car was meant for me, but this is beyond the beyond. My uncle began finding pieces of dog bones wrapped tightly in red cloth around the precarious corners of the house. A tantric confirmed that this was a manifestation of black magic, and that one of grandaunts who lived in the ancestral village had been doing it. He also told us that the ritual performed on our family involved stuffing a live chicken inside a matka, earthen pot, and then burying it deep inside the earth. Now, in our case, the matka, called Maran Patra, killing bowl, had been buried 7 hastas, handful deep. This meant that the ritual was irreversible, and similar to a kamikaze attack, would affect the caster too later in life. But my grandmother was in denial that her sister could do something so ghastly, and forbade us from confronting her. This specific grandaunt had always been jealous of my grandmother because she was sterile. On the other hand, my grandmother had 3 sons, which in the socio-patriarchal society of Bihar was considered extremely desirable. When my uncle was an infant, he'd start running high fever whenever they visited the ancestral village. The fever would subside as soon as a protective locket was placed around his neck, given to my grandmother by a temple priest. Once, my uncle was running a high temperature even when the locket was firmly in place. When contacted, the priest calmly told my grandmother that someone had removed the yantra, the comic diaphragm, placed inside the locket, and that he'd been sending her a new one. The locket did indeed turn out to be empty. My aunt passed away after a short illness in 2019, leaving behind her 2-year-old son. We didn't suspect any foul play, although what happened in the next few days led us to believe we were missing something. In Hindu tradition, a 13-day period of mourning, Kahavi, is declared from the day the loved one passes. Throughout these 13 days, our house was behest with paranormal activity. Toys placed near the baby's crib would suddenly switch themselves on and make shrill noises. The baby would bounce around the crib as if some unseen force was trying to lift it and failing. The utensil racks would start shaking in the middle of the night, and lights would flicker for no apparent reason. A part of Tirai ritual involves offering a bowl of flour to crows and other small animals, whom we consider to be the reincarnation of our ancestors. In my aunt's case, the animals refused to come near the offerings, let alone partake in any of it. Most of the relatives insinuated that our aunt was still attached to her son and was so refusing to cross over. Then on the 13th day, our suspicions were confirmed when something happened that I'm still unable to explain to this day. On the first day of Taravi, an earthen lamp called Daya was lighted inside the bedroom where the deceased resided. On each successive day, the lamp is placed a little far from the bedroom and towards the exit door, symbolically giving a send-off to the departed soul. On the final day, the lamp is to be placed outside the house, giving finality that the soul had crossed over. When my aunt's lamp was placed outside the house, the wick refused to catch fire. I say refused because we went through a box of matches trying to light the dyer, but in vain. Some of the oil spilled over on the box, rendering the leftover matches useless. Someone was sent outside to get a fresh box. Lighter and stove fire cannot be used since it's considered sacrilegious. Overtly religious aunts of the family began crying at this sight, when one of them struck upon an idea. For context, there is a Pran-Prathisit life-infused idol of goddess Kali enshrined in our home. My grandfather had requisitioned the idol from a Shakti worshipper in 1977, but couldn't bring her home till 1978, since Indira Gandhi had imposed emergency throughout India. He used to worship her by giving oblations of his own blood. So, for 40 continuous years, she has been worshipped by our family and treated as a mother. She's offered food twice a day, bathed and cleaned by the female members, and is offered a gold chain on every occasion. Once there was a great fire in the slum near our house, and our maid, who suffered serious burns, had lost everything in it. When we went to visit her in hospital, she fell at the feet of my grandmother, wailing and confessing that she had stolen a chair from the mother's goddess's neck. And what happened to her was retribution. Another time, my mother didn't want to attend a wedding and prayed for her that she excused from the event. The next day, my mother's entire luggage that included her jewellery and finery was stolen from the train, and she spent the entire day inside a police station rather than the wedding. I could go on and on about her stories, but I will confine myself to this event. Finally, one of my aunts rushed into Mother Kali's shrine and with folded hands screamed, "Mother, please help her." To my surprise, the wick instantly caught flame. The rest of the rituals performed were uneventful. Throughout his life, my grandfather lived in a village near Hazarabi in Ranchi, Jharkhand. Paranormal activity was a common occurrence and a part of life where he resided. There was a superstition among the natives of the village that a woman who dies while pregnant would become a Chaldale witch. The only way to prevent this was by crossing the arms of the corpse and driving a long nail through both of them. Once in the early 1960s, when my grandfather was around 14, a pregnant woman who lived in the neighborhood passed away. Usually, the corpse is cremated, but due to the superstition, the villagers dare not come near it. Hence, they left her body under a nearby banyan tree. Rumours began circulating throughout the village that they had forgotten to put a nail through the corpse, and that the woman would now become a Chudale. The rumours reached the ears of the schoolboys, and being reckless teenagers, they dared each other to drive a nail through the corpse. Enough taunts from his mates led my grandfather into accepting the challenge. At midnight, he reached the banyan tree with a nail, quickly crossed the arms of the corpse and hammered it in. Then he ran away into his house and slept throughout the night. He was woken up by his mother screaming at him, "What did you do? Where were you last night?" She said, "Mother, I haven't done anything," he lied. "You drove a nail through her corpse, didn't you?" she inquired. "How do you know about that?" he said, bewildered at his mother's knowledge. Last night at around 3 a.m., someone began knocking on the door. I thought it was some emergency and decided to open it. Our neighbour, who'd just passed away, was standing outside and crying profusely. I felt scared, but mustered up the courage to ask her what was wrong. She told me what she had always treated you like a son, and that you disrespected her by putting a nail through her. She told me to ask you what had done to suffer such fate. After saying this, she disappeared. My great-grandmother concluded. My grandfather felt very guilty for what he had done. He removed the nail from her corpse, gave her a proper cremation, and performed all rituals that are supposed to be performed by a son. The first one I remember is from when I was only a couple months or even weeks old. I remember having a fully developed adult consciousness and feeling like I was stuck inside of a baby's body. My mum would wrap me in a sheet as a baby so that I couldn't move whatsoever. A lot of Eastern European parents did that in the 90s. I wanted to scream out for help, but didn't know language yet, so I just lay there, terrified and imprisoned, wondering how I got into that tiny body. The next one I remember was when I was around 6 or 7. I was playing with a friend of mine in my room, laughing and just doing normal kid things, when all of a sudden, I felt like I had to look up into one corner of the room, and in that moment, I felt something enter me. Everything inside me changed in that moment and almost kind of sank. Whatever that entity was, it felt dark and I was never the same afterward. I have had a lifelong history of being bullied, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, dark fantasies, and illegal substance dependency. The next experience is probably the most terrifying one I remember, and I remember it vividly. When I was little, my parents would often send me to Finland to spend the summer with my grandparents. We lived in Estonia. When I was 9, they decided to send me to Russia instead, so I'd spend it with my great aunt. My great aunt had an old cottage-style house and a sauna on her property. One time, my great aunt and grandmother told me we would all be going to the sauna, but asked me not to speak after we leave it. I said I wouldn't. We went into the sauna, and my great aunt sat me down on a bench. They kneeled down in front of my face and said some weird words, after which I fell into a trance-like state. I was still awake, but everything around me was hazy, like in a dream. Then my grandmother lay down on one of the top benches, and my great aunt started cracking chicken eggs and putting other stuff in my grandmother's body. I tried to move my body but couldn't. However, I managed to turn my head a little to the right and noticed a massive mirror standing against the wall on the floor. So as I'm looking at it, that mirror lifted off the ground and started floating in small circles in a clockwise direction. I did not dream it happened. It really happened. I remembered it so clearly. I felt like screaming in terror in that moment, but I couldn't. My mouth was shut and couldn't move. Once my great aunt and grandmother were done whatever they were doing, we showered, got dressed, and left the sauna. At that point, I completely forgot about my promise not to seek. So I blurted out something like, "Well, that was actually really nice." And they got so angry with me. Only years later did I find out they were actually during a youth spell. And to talk about doing something like that was to null it or make it void. That's why they were angry. 15 years after that incident, when I was visiting my grandmother in Finland, I asked her about that day and also if she was into witchcraft. She pretended she didn't know what I was talking about and denied it. My mum claims that my grandma is a witch, and a powerful one. The next experience was extremely odd and one of the happiest moments of my life. I moved to the UK with my dad when I was 10. We lived in a city called Southampton. In Southampton, there was this huge, beautiful park. I can't remember what it's called, but it was massive. I used to love walking all over it by myself. Being a new immigrant kid, I didn't have many friends and was an introvert anyway, preferring my own company. One evening when I was walking, I walked right along an old cemetery that was on the park grounds. It was golden hour, and the light was shining through the trees in such a magical way. It was absolutely stunning. As I was walking, I felt a certain grave call out to me and ask me to come near it, so I did. The grave told me to lie down on it, so I did. Then, in a state of absolute bliss, I fell asleep. That was practically the best nap of my life. I woke up with a feeling of such overwhelming happiness that I cried, thanked the grave, and left. The next experience was interesting. My dad and I emigrated from the UK to Canada via sailboat. Our first stop was in La Coruña, Spain. There, we met the crew of a Ukrainian container ship that was on quarantine and became very good friends with them. There was a woman on board who was a chef. Apparently, she took my dad aside and in secret and told him, "I have a special gift," as in something related to occultism or spiritualism. Dad only told me about this after we left port. As I got older, these experiences decreased. I get the occasional deja vu, but haven't had a paranormal experience in a while. I think it's something when you are more open to it as a child, and as an adult, you somehow become closed off to that world. Has anyone else experienced events throughout their life? This happened in Pennsylvania, in the Allegheny National Forest in 2009-10. I don't remember exactly. It was when the National Rainbow Gathering was there. I was hitchhiking the East Coast at the time and made my way there. Ran into a buddy I had met in Florida a few months before, and she was there with a friend, so they adopted me and I camped with them. Me and Dana decided to camp alongside the main trail to get away from all thousands of hippies. The main trail goes from a camp, the parking lot, to the main circle in the heart of the gathering, and it's a couple-mile trek. So we were out there alone besides the main trail traffic. It was dusk, and we were having a heavy talk about spirituality and whatnot, hippie stuff, when we decided to go down to the main circle to get some food. We were standing up, and I began to stomp out the little twig fire we had, when Anna said, "Do you hear that?" I stopped and listened, and it sounded like someone walking in the forest towards us. At this same moment, some people on the main trail had stopped and were smoking cigarettes, and were talking amongst themselves, oblivious to us. Me and Anna listened to these footsteps quickly moving into view, and we could see nothing. The footsteps kept going, and there was nothing there. My mind was misfiring, trying to figure it out. We could actually see the footfalls of twigs snapping and leaves moving. Whatever it was went right up to those people on the trail and seemed to slow its pace, like it was checking them out. They were totally oblivious to this, talking to each other in a circle. Then it just came right up to me and Anna and slowed down like it was checking us out. I wasn't scared, just really confused, frozen to the spot. The entire time, Anna was fumbling with a keychain she had got with a million things attached to it, and finally found this little flashlight and shone it and said, "Hey." Whatever it was a feet away from me, bounded off up the hill very fast. If I wanted to run after it, I couldn't have. It was really fast. Like the steps became machine gun steps. Me and Anna took off down the hill, totally panicked. To me, it sounded like a child's spread, walking, if that makes sense. The steps were short, but fast, almost like robotic-like. Or insect-like. This really happened, and Anna would refuse to talk about it after. She was totally freaked. I had to go back up and pack up the camp. We live in Utah, and my uncle Mark went on a mission at 19. They sent him to an Indian reservation in Arizona. They paired him up with a companion named Carl. When they first got there was a huge rift with the locals on the reservation with them being there. They didn't want my uncle and Carl staying on the reservation grounds. Eventually, they came to a compromise that they would stay on the outskirts in a trailer. This reservation wasn't very big and was located next to a heavily wooded area. The first night, they were trying to sleep when all of a sudden their trailer started to shake violently back and forth. Startled and not sure what was happening, they climbed under their table for cover. Mark could distinctively hear someone pushing it from both sides of the trailer, like a group of people. After about 5 minutes, it stopped. The next day, they made rounds on the reservation and were talking to the locals. Carl made a comment to one of the families that their trailer was shaking that night before. The family got very quiet and then told them they had to leave. They thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it. The next night, it happened again. They awoke to their trailer shaking back and forth. Again, they climbed under the table until it stopped. This went on for 2 more nights. Anytime they tried to talk to anyone about it, they got quiet and told them to leave. Mark started thinking that due to the tension of their arrival, the locals were doing this to scare them off the reservation. They then go into a convenience store and they were talking together about how frustrated they were with the situation. The clerk overheard and said, "They can't talk about it. It's forbidden." Confused, they ask him, "Can't talk about what?" The guy continues to tell them about the Shinwalkers. He says they are evil demons that were once born Native American white witches. If they talk about it, the Skinwalkers will come for their souls. They just walked out of there baffled. They thought it was another scare tactic. So that night, when the shaking started again, my uncle decided to be brave and confront them. He went to the trailer door, flung it open, and yelled, "Hey!" When he did that, he saw these 3 animals run off. 2 were a wolf and 1 was a bear. But they looked strange, almost with human features. As he watched them run towards the trees, all 3 stood up on 2 legs and walked slowly towards the trees, making a human cackling laugh. It scared him so bad that they called their mission president the next morning and asked to be moved. They were relocated for a day. For a year, nothing happened. One day, they announced that Carl was being relocated to another city, and Mark was getting a new companion, Jimmy. They had to drive about an hour to pick Jimmy up from the airport. The road they travelled went through the boundaries of the reservation. They arrived at about 8 p.m. and met Jimmy, and they got to leave. The mission president tells Jimmy, "We're driving through a dangerous area at night, so we can't make any stops. If you need to use the restroom, you need to go now." Jimmy says, "I'm fine." The mission president gets serious enough to even freak out Mark. "I'm not kidding. Go do your business." Jimmy was insistent this time. So they hit the route. As they were about 30 minutes into the drive, they were going through the area of the reservation boundaries. Jimmy starts complaining that he needed to pee badly. The mission president says, "We can't stop here. You'll just have to hold it." Jimmy keeps going on. "I really can't hold it." So the mission president stops the car and says, "Okay, but you will do your business next to the door. And I say get into the car. You better get into the car fast." With a look of confusion, Jimmy says, "All right," opens the door and starts to do his business. About 5 seconds later, the mission president says nothing and just yanks Jimmy into the car and floors it. Jimmy and Mark start freaking out, saying, "What's going on?" The mission president says nothing and just increases his speed. All of a sudden, what is going on? The mission president says nothing and just increases his speed. All of a sudden, Mark sees something next to the car on his right. A giant wolf-looking man was running on 2 feet next to the car. Man looked at the speedometer. They were going over 60 miles an hour and still increasing. The wolf creature kept right next to the car for 10 minutes until it finally took off into the trees. Shaking, Jimmy gets out of the car when they arrive. They didn't speak through the whole ordeal and says, "What did I just see?" The mission president says, "Next time I tell you to take care of your business, you take care of your business."